Perhaps you have heard of a modern tradition called Christmas in summer. In America, for example, we have Christmas in July. Not many people observe it, and it isn't a real holiday. Long story short, it's simply Christmas copied and pasted into July for the sake of having a holiday in a period in which there is a lull in holidays. But what if I told you that there used to be a real Christmas in summer? Well, it wasn't actually Christmas in summer, but it was a major holiday, one of the most major of the year in fact, celebrated in June by the same cultures that celebrated Christmas. The holiday stretched back to the early Middle Ages and was observed for well over 1,000 years, declining in popularity only relatively recently. It's called St. John the Baptist's Day, also known as Midsummer, and it falls each year on June 24th. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. In this video, we're going to be talking about the history and practices of this holiday, how it was celebrated, the legends associated with it, the food that was eaten, why it may have disappeared, where it didn't disappear, and more. Many, especially in the English-speaking world, were probably first introduced to the Festival of Midsummer through the 2019 film, Midsummer. Thus, I'd like to make it clear from the start that that movie is a horror movie about a fictional cult, not a factual representation of Midsummer. In fact, the movie has little to do with the real, generally quite lighthearted and fun celebration. But there are some elements within the movie that are representations of real customs of this holiday celebrated not only in Sweden, but other countries as well, and not very long ago, across Europe in various forms. To begin, let's ask, who is the St. John of St. John's Day? His full story is too long to tell here, but, in summary, St. John the Baptist was Jesus' second cousin, the son of Mary's cousin Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah. He is believed to have been chosen as the prophet who was to immediately precede the Messiah to prepare the way for him. In the Bible, it is said that John foretold that Christ was soon to come, and directed his followers to follow Christ after his baptism, a baptism which John the Baptist himself performed. He was later executed by King Herod and his niece-wife Herodias for his criticism of their marriage, which he believed violated God's law. June 24th is St. John's feast day. A feast day doesn't necessarily mean a day on which to eat a lot of food. It refers to an annual observance of a given saint. Although, on this particular feast day, people did do a lot of feasting. The day is observed by various Christian groups such as Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and some Protestant denominations, such as Anglicans and Lutherans. His feast day was placed on June 24th because early Christian scholars marked it as his birthday. We'll talk about why later. Importantly, St. John is not worshipped on this day. He and his deeds are celebrated. St. John's feast day was established as late as the 4th century AD, in the latter ages of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire fell in the West, but Christianity, and with it, St. John's Day, endured and would further spread. Gradually, throughout the centuries, the holiday would take on more and more importance. While the date would retain its religious importance throughout much of its history, it would also begin to take on a much broader cultural meaning in this time. Midsummer became a day of festivity and secular customs alongside its religious aspects, much like Christmas, although we do not know much about these early celebrations. Furthermore, of course, celebrations varied across time and, to this day, vary across cultures. St. John's Day is on June 24th, but celebration could last for days before and after this day. St. John's Eve, also called Midsummer Eve, June 23rd, was a date of equal importance. Often celebrations would begin on St. John's Eve. The joint feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, June 29th, and thus the evening of June 28th were often included in the celebration period as well. This was a special time for Europeans. It was the height of the warmer season, near the summer solstice, thus the name Midsummer. It fell in the middle of the agricultural cycle, in between the spring sowing and summer haymaking in Northern Europe. It was a time to take a break. It was a time for parties, family, friends, and community, for feasting, music, and games. It was a time for reverence to God and for age-old traditions. It was also, as we shall see, a time for folklore and superstition. Many believed that on Midsummer Eve, magic and the supernatural were all the more abundant in our world. While traditions vary, some things are universal. One of the central elements of a St. John's Day celebration is fire. From Ireland to Finland to Spain to Greece, bonfires were often lit on St. John's Eve at sunset and kept throughout the night into early midsummer morning. These included both family and large communal fires. There was emphasis on these communal fires being lit on mountains and hilltops in some areas, and on beaches and along rivers in others. But a St. John's fire could be lit anywhere, even the center of town. It is recorded that the English kings Henry VII and Henry VIII ordered the construction of midsummer bonfires in their great halls. Often, the lighting of the fire would be preceded by speeches and prayers. In some cases, the oldest present was tasked with lighting the fire, while the youngest would throw an animal bone into it. This would be followed by a number of other rituals and the aforementioned merrymaking. A central tradition found all across Europe was to jump over the fires. Doing so is said to bring good luck. Weeds and old furniture were often tossed into the fires. Animal bones were often included as fuel for the fires, which is where we get the term bonfire from bone fire. It was also believed that holy objects, such as old rosary beads, could be destroyed in St. John's fires without disrespect. As the fires wound down, its embers and ashes might be distributed to the members of the community, who believed these remnants to have special properties. The following morning, in many areas, cattle would be driven through the remaining ashes, and the ashes would be spread on the crops for good luck. Another fiery midsummer tradition, found in multiple areas, involved rolling a cartwheel covered with straw up a hill, setting it ablaze, then letting it loose to roll downhill. A description of such a practice from Wales in the 1820s states that if the fire went out before the wheel reached the bottom of the hill, it was a sign of a poor harvest to come. But if it stayed lit all the way down, a bountiful harvest could be expected. As festive as these rituals were, they were also matters of seriousness. Midsummer was the time just before the crops and livestock would be the most sensitive to disease. Likewise, diseases like plague and malaria would be worse for humans in the late summer. Traditions like these, connected to Christian belief in some circumstances, but also to a belief in folk magic in others, with an emphasis on blessing the food supply and protection against harm, were reflective of real anxieties people had at this time of year. Throughout Europe, religious processions and plays focusing on the life of St. John were common on the streets around this time. Fairs and parades were also common. With the introduction of fireworks to Europe in the late Middle Ages, they were very naturally associated with the holiday in places like Italy. Swimming, and other customs involving going into, or at least to the water, were also ubiquitous, not only because it was summer, but also in reference to St. John the Baptist's role as a Baptist as well. As far back as the 14th century, for example, Petrarch records a custom of German women rinsing their hands in the Rhine River to wash away bad luck on this date. Naturally, baptisms are common on St. John's Day. The decorations for midsummer emphasize the liveliness of the summer season, incorporating a colorful variety of flowers and plants. One particular example is St. John's wort, a herb which tends to flower around St. John's Day, thus the name. Women in many countries, such as Poland, wear crowns of flowers on their heads, which they may toss into a local body of water for the men to jump in and race to retrieve. Men sometimes wear crowns of leaves. In Sweden, a maypole is often erected on midsummer. This is a great wooden pole found in the traditions of many Germanic cultures from England to Sweden. They are often decorated with leaves and flowers. People may gather to dance in circles around the maypole or to feast around it. The maypole is sometimes said to have originated as a symbol of fertility, but the majority of scholars reject this explanation. Historian Mircea Eliade argued maypoles to be decorations that heralded the return of the warm times. This is probably why it's associated in England, where summer comes earlier, more with May Day on May 1st. Interestingly, bonfires are actually less common in Sweden on midsummer, and more common on the night before May Day there, called Walpurgis Night. The 15th century English historian John Stowe wrote of St. John's Day, emphasizing the social nature of the celebration, suggesting it was a community-building event in which people were encouraged to socialize and make friends with other members of the community. Multiple accounts describe a custom of hosts, typically the wealthier, leaving food like meat or sweet bread and drink out for strangers, often the impoverished, and inviting them to sit with them or even to come inside their homes and dine with them. Speaking of food, there are a wide array of foods popular on St. John's. As you might expect, many of these involve fruits and other foods available during early summer. In Sweden, wild strawberries, which are different from garden strawberries, are easily found around midsummer. They are picked and gathered on straws, and also included in numerous dishes, such as jordgubbstårta, a kind of strawberry and cream cake. In Ireland, a simple dessert called goody was popular on St. John's Eve, made from breadcrumbs, milk, sugar, and spices, boiled together, often over the St. John's fire itself. Fish and potatoes were also eaten by several cultures at this time. In Spain, specifically areas such as Catalonia, one may find the coca de San Juan. Coca refers to a broad variety of pastries. The coca de San Juan is often made with things like pine nuts and candied fruits. As mentioned, there is a magical aspect to this holiday, somewhat like Halloween or Christmas, perhaps something in between the two. St. John's Eve was regarded as a night in which the mystical and the supernatural were all the more abundant in our world. Indeed, the bonfires were sometimes said to be lit for the purpose of driving evil spirits, witches, dragons, and the like away. Herbs like St. John's wort, if picked on St. John's Eve especially, were said to have much more potent healing powers. Hanging it on a building could keep evil spirits away. Across Europe, one could find will-o'-wisps appearing on Midsummer Eve, especially if a person located a mythical flowering fern. Magical charms were said to manifest in hidden locations, such as rings made by snakes that granted its wearer things like wealth, power, or invisibility. An English legend states that there is an ancient oak tree in Broadwater in West Sussex, around which a group of skeletons can be observed on Midsummer Eve, dancing until dawn. It was said in Ireland that if a house lay in the path of fairies, midnight noises and supernatural manifestations would be experienced by the inhabitants on Midsummer Eve. As far back as the Middle Ages, divination rituals, or future-telling, were popular on the holiday. Many such rituals focused on love. Because of the supernatural aura surrounding the holiday, such rituals were deemed all the more potent. There are far too many examples to list them all out, but a typical one can be observed in Sweden to this day. The tradition involves a girl picking special flowers, usually 7, and placing them under her pillow on Midsummer Eve. While she sleeps, it is said that the face of the man she will one day marry will appear in her dreams. This tradition was once common across Germanic countries like England. Yarrow, sweet yarrow, the first that I have found. In the name of Jesus Christ, I pluck it from the ground. As Joseph loved sweet Mary and took her for his dear, so in a dream this night I hope my true love will appear. A similar English tradition involved 3 girls baking what is called a dumb cake. Dumb in this case means silent, not stupid, so named because the girls who baked the cake together must remain completely silent without even a whisper throughout its preparation. Only 2 of the girls are actually meant to bake the cake. The third is tasked with placing pieces of it under each of their pillows. Like the flower tradition, they are said to dream of their future husbands after having done so. Not every divination ritual pertained to love, however. For example, another legend held that if one fasted all day on Midsummer Eve, then sat by their local church, at midnight, they would see the spirits of those who were to die in the coming year appear, walk up to the church door, and knock on it in the order in which they were to die. This was also done on St. Mark's Eve, April 24th. By the later Middle Ages, midsummer had become a quarter day in countries like England. Quarter days served as important milestone dates, placed roughly every 3 months, as the name implies, around which various affairs would be based. For example, things like leases, terms of employment, educational activities, and political terms would often begin and end on these dates. The others, in England, were Annunciation Day, March 25th, Michaelmas, September 29th, and Christmas, December 25th. The early church believed June 24th was St. John's birthday because the Gospel of Luke explicitly states that St. John was conceived 6 months before Christ. The Bible doesn't say when exactly either of these dates were, but because early Christian scholars believed he was conceived around Passover on the Annunciation Day I just mentioned, March 25th, they marked the birth 9 months after. Thus, St. John's Day fell 6 months before December 25th, or June 24th. But why the 24th and not the 25th? The answer isn't clear, but it may relate to how the Romans counted dates. Christmas was placed on the 8th day before the calends, or the first day of the month, of January. St. John's Day may have followed suit, being placed on the 8th day before the calends of July, but as there are only 30 days in June, this would place it a day earlier. St. John's Day is still celebrated in places like Cornwall, which revived it, Scandinavia, the Baltic, Southern Europe, and even places outside Europe, like the Philippines and much of Latin America. In Quebec, the holiday is quite popular, though it has been separated from many of its religious and folk customs and is mostly a patriotic festival. There are still some celebrations in areas of countries like the UK, Ireland, France, and Germany, but they are much less common than they once were, having slowly faded away over the course of centuries. In places like the United States and Oceania, the holiday is almost totally unheard of, apart from a few small, scattered exceptions. Why? What happened to St. John's Day? The disappearance of a holiday can be as complicated and uncertain as its origins. However, there are several things which are clear. In the 16th century, numerous different Protestant groups began to emerge across Europe. These groups had differing opinions about things like the holidays. In fact, they still do. Some groups, like the Puritans of England, were extremely critical of them. They pursued not only an end to Midsummer, but also holidays like Christmas as well. They viewed Midsummer as a festival linked to the traditional Catholic order, scoffed at folk elements like magic fires and charms, and were aghast at the public's behavior on such days. Holidays prior to the Victorian era were often full of drunkenness, debauchery, and all forms of what was considered unhinged sin. Henry VIII himself later became hostile to the holiday because of the potential for a celebration to turn into a riot. In the 18th century, those who disdained holidays were joined by secularists who sought to separate their societies from what were seen as archaic religious traditions, and governments seeking to reduce the number of days the working population had off of work. Many German and Scandinavian countries actually officially banned the celebration around this time, along with a list of other holidays. Things like lifestyle changes following industrialism might have contributed to the disappearance as well. No longer were the rituals and traditions connected to agriculture so important to the population's increasingly distance from it. There is a record from an elderly man from Limerick, Ireland, presented in the book The Year in Ireland by Kevin Danaher, which discusses celebrating Midsummer, written in 1943. The author speaks of it largely as a memory, which their elders told them about, and says that the remaining traditions were mostly only observed by children by that point. This suggests it faded in popularity only in the late 19th and early 20th century in some areas. But if Christmas was swept up into all of this too, why wasn't Midsummer revived like Christmas was? Again, it's difficult to say. Part of the answer might actually lie in the United States. Many European holidays were revived and even globalized, at least in part because of American influence. The most glaring explanation for why Americans never developed an interest in St. John's Day is that it falls too close to Independence Day on July 4th. The two holidays certainly aren't the same thing, but they do have enough in common to where any immigrants pining for a St. John's Day celebration were probably satisfied with exchanging it for the great summer festival already in place in America only a week and a half later. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. To support the channel, you may make a donation on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. A special thanks to my current patrons listed here. I also run a science channel called Lucinox, so if that sounds interesting, be sure to check that out too. Thank you for watching, and I would like to wish you a happy St. John's or Midsummer Eve and Day.